podcast. This is a podcast series brought to you by Web3 Sanctuary, in a series where we delve into the practical applications of real-world impact of Web3 technologies. Each episode moving forward will feature an in-depth conversation with founders and executives pioneering Web3 companies, bringing you first-hand insights, experiences, and stories from the forefront of the digital revolution of blockchain. My name is Devon, and I'm going to be your host. And this podcast is brought to you by Web3 Sanctuary. Also on the podcast with me today, my first guest is Melyn McKay. And Dr. Melyn McKay is the founder of Koala Pay. She has over a decade of experience in the foreign aid sector. And for anyone keen on ensuring their donations are effectively utilized, her platform Koala Pay offers an innovative approach. So before I think I give too much away actually about Koala Pay and about Melyn, I'd like to actually give yourself a moment to introduce you. Tell me a little bit about your background, and if you can share a little bit about your journey as well, and how you went from being an anthropologist to working with major international organizations and diving into the Web3 space.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me. It's always great to chat to other folks in Web3 and especially other women in Web3. So really happy to be here today. You asked an interesting question, which is the transition from anthropologist to aid. I think actually those two things are pretty indelibly linked. I did my undergraduate work in anthropology in the US and then went straight into aid work when I was 25. I think I was in a clinic in rural Burundi, and then just sort of went from Burundi to South Sudan to Lebanon, working on Syria, and then ended up specializing for my doctoral work, which is also in anthropology, in Myanmar. So have been living and working in anthropology and aid sort of simultaneously. And I think that makes sense a little bit because my area of focus is qualitative research. And that is very useful in the aid sector because we do a lot of program planning and design. So I'm very much involved in the sort of strategy of how you design an aid project and then how you actually implement it and then how you evaluate its success. So I've been involved in sort of all stages of the aid sector in that sense. So having the anthropological training was actually sort of went hand in hand with what I was doing for work. I ended up in Web3 in a sort of roundabout way because I'd been, like I said, living in all these contexts where in the aid sector, we just had the exact same problems that we encountered over and over and over again. Hard to get money to local partners, issues with liquidity, very slow, often bureaucratic processes to ensure that people were getting paid. And when I say people, I mean local partners, the organizations that are really delivering aid on the ground level. So had seen these same things causing problems in the sector for a long time and just got really frustrated that I wasn't seeing any new solutions. So very luckily happened to have a person in my back pocket who I knew was working in the Web3 space. And I said, look, I want to talk to you about this thing. I don't know what I don't know, but I have the sense that this might solve a problem that we have in the sector. And luckily he got very excited. And that's sort of how Koala Pay was born. So it really came out of my experience in the sector and trying to fix a problem that I'd just been bumping my head up against for almost 15 years and being, lucky enough that I knew somebody in the space that I could go to and get some feedback from.
And I mean, like playing around in the international aid industry, which is, I think at the moment, like $100 billion industry. So trying to find an infrastructure solution for something like that, it must be incredibly challenging. And I mean, it's not a small problem that you're taking on with this.
Yeah, I think people generally, when we say we do, international aid, their first thought is charity. And it's really important to differentiate those things. The example I often give is that, like Save the Children, for example, globally, 75% of its funding comes from government sources. It doesn't come from individual donations. So that's not to say you shouldn't donate as an individual, that it's not worthwhile, just that is not the only place that they're getting money from. And so if you think about that, what that really means is that some of those large international nonprofits are actually acting as fund managers for various governments. So Save the Children receives $75 million from the US government, and then they're actually overseeing a consortium of lots of different partners who are delivering completely different projects, right? That are all under the same umbrella of a single program, but they're working in different geographies. It could be one partner is doing education, one partner is doing health. And so the idea of how you hold all that together, right now, a lot of that is done by hand, and it's done in a lot of Excel sheets, which is, not the most efficient way of doing that. And so really what we're focused on is trying to provide an end-to-end solution for that sort of grants and fund management process that's really tailored to the aid sector. But it's interesting having conversations with folks who don't even know that that's what's going on behind the scenes. They don't know that some of the biggest companies in the aid sector, I think Chemonics, it only works in the aid sector. This year, I think they're about a $3 billion company. So it's much more complicated than just going out and raising funds for a charity you love. There's a lot more happening behind the scenes.
It's quite nuanced as well in that sense. And I think a lot of people that aren't in the sector, as you mentioned, are very unaware of how it actually works and what you need to do to make it work. Can you dive into a little bit more actually about Koala Pay and what Koala Pay actually does and how you are impacting this industry using Web3 technologies?
Sure. Koala Pay is essentially what we call last mile infrastructure for localization. Localization in the aid sector is a term that we use to acknowledge that the way we have done international aid for a very long time is that we take a bunch of people from Europe or the US or Australia and we drop them in the middle of a country where they don't speak the language, they don't know the issues. And that's true for myself as well. I mean, I spent about 6 or 7 years in Myanmar, and I speak Burmese at least enough to be dangerous. And I still wouldn't claim that I really understand all the issues that people are facing. So the common aid sector rotation is anywhere from 1 year to 2 years. It's just not enough time to really understand a place. So we really are dependent on local aid actors, these local organizations, civil society organizations, to access communities, deliver projects and programs, and to provide services in a way that is sort of tailored to their needs and long-term sustainability of those interventions. It's very hard to pay them. And it's very hard to engage them for a bunch of reasons. It could be because you're working with a refugee population. So you want to work with people from within that community who are also refugees. If they don't have bank accounts, how do you pay them? How do you do like a KYC to make sure that the money's not going to financing sort of armed conflicts? So there's a lot of intricacy there in terms of how we work with these non-standard actors. Koala Pay is really focused on trying to build out an infrastructure that makes it easier to work with those actors. We do a full due diligence process, KYC, AML, sanctions, but we've adapted it to work with what we call non-standard actors. So that could be women-led organizations, youth-led organizations, refugee-led organizations, who might have very good reasons why they're not formally registered in the places where they're working or where they don't have certain documents. So we really adapted that process to work with those kinds of actors, but to give donors all of the safety and security they need to meet their compliance needs. So once the local partners get through that due diligence process, they're able to access an activity proposal form that's very streamlined. They submit activity details. So let's say one of the projects that we have on the platform right now is a women-run network of nurses who are providing healthcare to at least 5,000 people, almost singularly in that context. There's not a lot of other healthcare options. And they're asking for funding to support buying essential medicines for those clinics that are serving that population. So they're very specific activities they're proposing. And then the donors, and in our system, a donor is anyone who's sending aid money through the platform. So that could also be a large INGO. The donors can log into the marketplace. They can see all the different activity proposals. They have all the due diligence materials they need to evaluate whether that's a good local partner. They can fund that activity through our smart contract. They're funding the activities that the partner has proposed, and the payment is going directly wallet to wallet. So we don't custody any funds. And then we also provide some evaluation support on the other side of that. And we're building out some new tools to be able to do that in an even more automated way. So from start to finish, we're trying to make the process of working with local partners, moving money from Brussels to Bujumbura much more streamlined and with fewer pieces along the way where things can leak out or where the funds could be diverted.
Definitely. And it's almost wild to kind of see such a new technology being used for something that's been happening for so long.
Yeah.
These kind of systems, I mean, I guess historically have always been this way because there are, I guess, like people that would take some off the top and there's some funding that maybe doesn't make it through to the people that actually need it. Are you facing any skepticism or resistance from the traditional humanitarian actors towards integrating blockchain into your solution and towards your solution that you're working towards now?
You know, it's funny. When I first started building it, I was very worried about this. And it was something that I raised pretty continuously with some of our early investors and said, look, I want a lot of time with you to talk through this sort of change management element of what we're doing. And in the beginning, I thought this is going to be a real uphill struggle. I have been pleasantly surprised by how interested and how open people in the sector are to the technology. And I think a big part of that is because the problem is so acute. I mean, we know we lost $100 million during the Syrian civil war because of foreign currency fluctuations. We know that, intermediary banks will hold aid funds for months in order to benefit from the interest on them, which means that that's delaying the funding that's getting to the communities. I mean, there's so many reasons why this is such a problem. People are really hungry for solutions. One of the ways I think we've also mitigated against some of that is that we focus very much on the problem, and we talk a little bit about the solution and the tech behind it. It's really more focused on, we understand the problem you're facing. We have a way to fix that, or at least to mitigate the worst issues that you're facing. And we very intentionally translate the language. So we're not talking about distributed ledgers or anything like that. We're saying, distributed processing, or things that are a little bit more accessible to people who don't maybe have any tech background, and who frankly sometimes don't want to know. They don't really want to know how it's working under the hood. They just want to know that it works. So
they just want a solution.
Exactly. So every once in a while, I start to get a little bit geeky about the technology. Now that I'm not a tech person at all, I have been learning as I'm going. But every once in a while, I get really excited. I'm like, oh, we're going to do this Oracle integration. It's going to be so incredible. And thankfully, I have a very good team around me who are all aid workers, who all come from that humanitarian background. So they'll sort of kick me under the table and say, the main thing you need to know is that we concede you 25% on this transaction. So it is a constant sort of struggle to stay focused on the solution and how it relates to the problem, versus getting excited about all the potential for the technology. Because I think that is off-putting for people in the aid sector sometimes.
I think it's also really interesting, and that's actually why I decided to start this series, is because I'm trying to find projects like yourself that are actually already today making an impact in the world, using this technology in a way that's tangible, that people can see it, like feel, touch, see it. It's more real than I guess a lot of blockchain solutions out there that a lot of people struggle to either relate to or put into practice in their minds. So I guess like trying to be that middle person in between kind of the tech guys, the deep blockchain tech guys, the investors, and then also the people on the ground that you're actually working with, is this huge like triangle sometimes of confusion and miscommunication.
Yeah. And actually, one of the things that we struggle with a lot is actually parsing through what is real and what is future planning or hype. Because we'll have, we'll see something, we'll say, oh, this is really interesting. We want to talk to these people about whether or not we could use this to achieve this goal that we're working toward. And it takes 3 or 4 months of conversation to work out that actually that thing's not built yet. And so, and I understand, because of course we're in the same situation. We're building as we're going, but the issue that creates for us then is that we lose time investigating potential solutions that actually, if somebody would have said, look, that's not ready yet, it'll be ready in 2 years, good, great. So then we'll focus on putting our own little patchwork together in the meantime. So I think, that is one of the challenges of having a real world application, is that there are a lot of, I've said this in other places, but lots of puzzle pieces that Web3 people are holding. And we're trying to place those puzzle pieces into a bigger picture. And what we're finding is sometimes it's like, there's that inevitable missing puzzle piece that's not there yet. And somebody's building it somewhere, but it's, it is a little bit of a process of working through, okay, that's great. I'm very excited for what you're working on. I can see it's going to be really impactful in the next 2 years, but right now I need something that does X, Y, Z. So it is, that is a kind of constant challenge.
Yeah, and I guess that is also part of the challenge of working with these new and emerging technologies, both from the technological advancements point of view, but also I guess from the regulation point of view, and adoption from the more mainstream adoption from the from the public. But you've actually already covered quite a couple of the questions or the challenges that I was wondering about, integrating Web3 solutions into humanitarian and international development work. But are there any others, I guess, that are pressing to you, or that you are still like working towards?
Yeah. It's funny because international aid often operates in this kind of gray zone anyway, because you have people who are living in a place, but they're not from that place, and they're, nonprofits, or it's the UN. So There is a lot of gray zone anyway around aid work. We are taking the approach of being overly compliant where we can. But of course, the challenge is that things are changing everywhere, and we are, working with the EU someplace, or we're working with a US-based nonprofit. You're going to have different concerns, so it means that we need to be very, very on top of what's happening with different legislation in different places. We're super lucky that we have become members of CMS Equip, which is a startup program that provides us with sort of best legal advice and support for a price tag that a startup in the aid sector can afford. That's been really helpful because it's helping us to navigate that. But I think more generally, one of the things that's super challenging is that a lot of the regulation that's coming out right now is very focused on trying to deal with the sort of speculative financial stuff that was happening a couple of years ago, which, I understand that. And of course, legislators are, for the most part, focused on their own populations and the kinds of things that are happening for them. I think unintended consequences is that there's a saying, you can't write policy for people you don't see. And a lot of legislators don't see populations in the quote unquote global South and some of the things that they're dealing with. And so because we are connecting those two things together, we feel this tension really acutely. And a very concrete example of that is that we wanted to work with USDC for one of our pilots in Somalia, a place where we know there's going to be at a minimum 1.6 million people affected by flooding and famine in the coming years. We had this great project. We were going to, do this Oracle integration to do what's called anticipatory action. So actually moving aid to communities on the ground in advance of them actually feeling the pain of a specific shock or stress. But we can't take that risk because USDC, of course, being in the US, at any time, it's not censorship resistant. So we could send all this money to these local partners who we do this very, very thorough due diligence and vetting of. But, Circle could just say, well, we're uncomfortable with people in Somalia holding these funds. And then we're in a very difficult position. So it's pushed us instead to have to work with a stable coin that, I think we can all agree we have some questions or concerns about. We would prefer to be working with a more entity, but we can't because the policies that have been written to protect American users or Americans in general have not been written with that sort of issue in mind. So I think, not to go on too long about this, obviously I feel pretty passionate about it, but ensuring that we have folks from a lot of different walks of life and a lot of different places represented in those kinds of policy conversations is a big concern of ours and something that we're hoping to be engaged in more of those conversations on a regular basis.
No, definitely. And I actually do think it's an incredibly interesting topic. And you do have vast experience, actually. And I want to touch a little bit more on your background in anthropology as well. But just before we get to that, what from your experience in conflict zones and understanding these social dynamics, how do you see Web3 technologies influencing either maybe even peace building and conflict resolution? And do you think that's even a possibility or a potential?
Good question. I go on a lot about this. So anyone who knows me will have heard me sort of make this statement before, but I think we vest a lot of trust in the nation state as a concept, and we tend to assume that that is a permanent and lasting thing, and also an objective thing, when for the vast majority of people in the world, that is not the case and has not been the case for a very long time. So I think if you take a step back and think about actually all of the things that are dependent on the fact that you are a citizen of a specific country, obviously people who are recent immigrants or who are legally illegal, however you want to, I don't think anyone is illegal, but, the way that people talk about those issues, they're going to be more aware of this than I think the average person who grows up in a place and, got a passport and doesn't think about it on a day-to-day basis. The reality is this entity controls your access to services. It controls your movement. It controls your records. And what you see in places where the nation state is not always, it can be antagonistic towards an ethnic group or religion, is that amount of control means that people are unable to live. Their lives and livelihoods are incredibly constrained by their relationship to that entity, and entity that they have very little control over or even means of communicating with. And so what I see as one of the most sort of exciting or hopeful areas for Web3 is the idea of storing certain documents on chain, of providing people with access to financial services regardless of their status. Things like registering land on chain so that you don't have land grabs in places where ethnic communities are having their land taken by military regimes, whatever it is. The idea of there being something that goes beyond the state or beyond a specific corporation that allows us to prove that something has happened, that someone is who they say they are, that they have certain documentation or services, I think is really, really powerful. And it's the kind of thing that if you have spent most of your life living in a place in the world where, your government and your financial system mostly works for you, you might see that as a nice to have. It's something that's a fun thing to play with. But if you are living in the vast majority of places on earth where that is not the case, where your government is either not working to support you or is actively working to undermine your ability to flourish, then having a system that gives you that sort of backup is immensely important to a person's well-being. I think that's one of the areas that I see as really indelibly linked to peace and conflict issues, because even like refugee wallets, for example, the ability to carry your entire life savings across a border when you need to flee from conflict, that's actually really hard to do now. So having a wallet that you own and you have control over offers a lot of opportunities for communities who are displaced, who are on the move, and understanding those dynamics and why Web3 offers a solution to that, if we handle it well, I think is really critical to understanding why there's so much support for Web3 among a lot of human rights activists and other folks who are worried about those issues.
I think that thank you so much for your answer. I think it's given me a lot to think about as well, things that I guess is just not part of my daily life as well. And some of the use cases as well that you presented. Are any of those, I guess, are there any other people working on similar type projects or use cases that you could maybe direct us to as well? I'd love to go and add some links into this afterwards as well.
Yeah, love the folks who are working on Leaf Wallet. Leaf Wallet is specifically designed for refugees. Nat Robinson over there is fantastic. I think Tori, one of the other co-founders, is now at Stellar Foundation. So, so there's a lot of focus on that in some places. There are, I know, some people working on things like land registration, or even more interesting to me in some ways is community currencies that allow, like KiraDAO, which I think has rebranded now, but KiraDAO for a while was focused on building an alternative community currency in Curacao to allow communities to be able to control their own economy in a context where, because of the dollar peg, the local currency was so limited in terms of what people could and couldn't do. So there's lots of really interesting examples there, and I'm super happy to share. Maybe when I repost this, I'll add some links to some of my favorite use cases. But there's so many. We just had an event in Nairobi actually last week, I guess, which was bringing Web3 and humanitarian aid people together into working groups. We sort of forced them to sit with each other, and then we gave the humanitarian folks, 30 minutes to complain, which they love doing. So that was a great way to kick off a session about the problems they face in the sector. And then we gave the Web3 people some time to propose solutions. And even those conversations, it's so clear that there's so much opportunity if you put these two things in conversation. And I think the most interesting use cases are coming out of, contexts where people are doing exactly that. And there's quite a few.
That's actually really interesting. Are you able to maybe share some of the cultural or societal insights that you got from working through those sessions with the Web3 people and the humanitarian aid sector people across all of these different regions that I know that you've been visiting? So for those of you as well that don't know, Melyn is constantly traveling to all over Africa, all over the world, and I'm always really impressed kind of why the communities that you do bring together and interact with, because I think so much of that is so important. Instead of just designing, I guess, like systems for people that you haven't heard of or haven't actually like immersed yourself in their culture of.
Yeah, I think kind of three things. The first is that there's this perception, I think, when I talk to people about what we're doing, every single time people say, well, what about the off-ramp? And I love that question because it betrays a lack of understanding about off-ramping fiat in a lot of places in the world. The entire time I lived in South Sudan, there was not a functional ATM. You just have to fly to Dubai, stuff my trousers full of cash, and then come back in through an airport where, there were guys with big guns. And that's still how a lot of money is being moved across South Sudan for aid programs today. So when we talk about the off-ramp, a lot of the places where there are limited off-ramps for crypto, there are also limited off-ramps for fiat. And so the fact that you have things like peer-to-peer trading outposts and things like that, those people have already had to figure out how to navigate a lack of financial access. So we're seeing some of the most innovative solutions coming out of those contexts. There is a reason why M-Pesa happened in Kenya and not in the United States, right? It was because it was a need. And I think we're going to see the same thing with various solutions in Web3 in a lot of these contexts. So I think, first and foremost, understanding that just because something that we don't use, or there's something we don't use, we assume that has no value. Recognizing that somebody else might find a lot of value in it because they don't have access to something else. Really being humble enough to acknowledge that the way we live is not how other people live, that there's insight that comes from those contexts in as much as we can, create solutions for them. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that there are a lot of folks in Web3 who really, really want to participate in like blockchain for good type activities. And I really laud that. I think that's important. And I love that ethos exists in the community. I think one of the drawbacks is that there's something in the aid sector that we jokingly call establishing field cred. And it is this sort of tiny dance that is done at every cocktail reception, at every embassy party, where aid workers quietly drop into conversation something sort of extreme that they had happened to them one time. Well, when I was in Afghanistan, when I was doing this. And it's to establish to the people there that you're a legit aid worker, people, you've really been through it. That it's very silly, but it's really done to show that the intricacies of the sector in a way. And it establishes expertise. What I see a lot of the time is that Web3 companies and Web3 folks come into these spaces and they don't know that that's what's happening. And so they think that they're having really great productive conversations, but they're actually just being quietly siloed off. And then they get really frustrated because they're like, well, we did this cool thing and we have this great technology, and why doesn't anyone want to work with us? And it's like, well, because they don't think that you have the expertise required to actually implement this. So I think that's something that I noticed in terms of a cultural element of the aid sector, is that it is very much a kind of gatekeeping process that is based on how much experience you have in those kinds of, we call them aid responses. And unless you can find a way to demonstrate that you understand that or you have participated in it, very, very difficult to gain access. The third and final thing I'll say is that the flip side of this on the Web3 side of things is that the Web3 language, the sort of slang terms and the GM friends and all that stuff, it, I think, emerged out of a desire to create a sense of an in-group identity, like I'm in the know, I'm part of the secret club. And that served a purpose in one way, but what it also does is it becomes exclusionary for people who are trying to get into the space and who don't use that language. There's no way I can go to the EU ambassador. And one of the biggest problems I have right now is that when I'm telling clients about what tools we're using in the back end of something, I'm like, well, we might use the, Lobster wallet, or we might use the Beans wallet. And it's, these names that, in the context of a program that's like ensuring livelihoods for recently conflict affected communities, you can see this disconnect there that makes it hard sometimes. So I think there is a need for the Web3 language to evolve a little bit and to become a little bit more adult and more inclusive and descriptive also, so that people can work out when they're interacting with something, whether it's usable or serious or not, because what it does is it makes people feel ill at ease if they're not from that insider group. They're very aware that they're not a part of it, and that it's hard for them to access because of the language stuff. So sort of three main takeaways from a cultural anthropologist's point of view about differences that I've seen over the course of the last few years.
Definitely. And I think Web3, still being it's not relatively new anymore, but it is still, but there are there are a multitude of terms and abbreviations and sub-communities within Web3 that it is almost a complete blocker to a lot of people. I mean, with my company now that we're just starting, we're doing educational Web3 ed tech for anyone basically wanting to get into the world of Web3. But even then, there's still so many barriers to entry that start as simple as having to define basic words that we use every single day that we don't realize aren't common to the rest of the world just because we're so in it.
Yeah.
So there is definitely a disconnect just in language even, between actually creating solutions together that can impact the real world.
Yeah, and I think building on that, we have this sort of issue in the aid sector where we introduce terms that come from a Western philosophical, like political philosophical perspective. So something like social cohesion as a term. And you'll go into conversations in places like rural Rakhine in the western part of Myanmar, and you'll hear somebody speaking in Rakhine language, and then all of a sudden you hear social cohesion in English. I always see that as a failure on our part to adequately localize these concepts, because if somebody can't describe a concept in their own language in terms that reflect a kind of natural evolution of thought in their own language, then it's very difficult for them to really own those things and participate in their creation. So similarly, on the Web3 side, super interesting to see how that language evolves over time, but critical to making sure that that works in an inclusive way is that the people who are participating in the creation of the language that we all share are from a variety of different backgrounds and places, and they're able to participate in their own languages as well as in a shared one.
Definitely. I mean, like, demystifying the technical jargon of Web3, and I guess also then integrating a whole new subset of jargon from the social sector. It's just we're creating this impossible scenario for basically anyone that maybe wants to hop into it.
Yeah.
But I think it's incredibly important when building trust and encouraging inclusivity and accessibility to both of these sectors, as well as in building a proper community where we can actually address these ethical and social implications that can be affected by these solutions. I'm gonna hop over to, I guess, like, we've had quite a nice chat now about some of the challenges, what you're working on, and I guess like what's happening in general across the sector at the moment. Where do you kind of see the future of Web3 in humanitarian aid and international development going in the next 5 to 10 years? And Web3 5 to 10 years seems like an impossible far time. I'm curious to kind of like hear your thoughts and where you think it's going.
Yeah. I would love to see Web3 really be the infrastructure for international aid. I think there are a lot of reasons why that makes sense. Like I said, traditional financial infrastructure was not built with international aid in mind, and we really suffer for that. We do fit into this gray area, so a lot of the legacy systems don't really work for us. And so what has happened is that the vast majority of aid processes are done by hand. So some of the largest private companies in the aid sector are almost exclusively consultancies, which I think really tells you a lot about where the value is coming from in the private part of the aid sector, and it's from inefficiency. Because if you're solving a problem, a process problem, by throwing consultants at it, and not just to say, let's streamline this process, but to actually do the process, everything from the due diligence to managing grants to like managing payments to managing evaluation, if that's all being done by just people power, something has gone very, very wrong. And I think the fact that is how the aid sector works speaks to the need for having tools. And again, the reason why that adoption has been slow, I think, is twofold. I think one, because the average aid worker has never met a tech person. That was certainly true for me, really, until very recently, till I met my co-founders. And that has been revolutionary for me because I can say, hey, I have this thing about AI. Can you tell me about it? I think a lot of people in the aid sector just don't know anyone in the tech sector. And so that's hard to have those conversations. But I think it's also that the tools that are built for industries where they, where do we see the biggest market? And because people don't see the aid sector as a market in that sense, even though very much is, the kinds of tools that are built are not really designed for aid sector users. So we do adopt some SaaS tools, along the way, but they're not really, they don't solve all of our problems. They don't really address the big pain points. So I think with Web3, and certainly with what we're trying to do at KoalaPay, is to be that, to provide that almost like a SaaS solution to the sort of common logistical needs, process needs that the aid sector has in managing itself, so that we can start to improve on some of those inefficiencies and the slowness, because of course inefficiency is not only costly, it loses time. And in aid, a time delay is the difference between survival and not in some cases. And so it is really both a business imperative, but also a moral imperative. So I think some of the speed benefits of transacting on blockchain, and also data, for example. I mean, this came up in our conversation in Nairobi, which is that the vast majority of aid folks, as I said, they sort of are in one place for 12 months and then they go on to the next place and the next place. And so, as you can imagine, what that means is that all the times we send out teams to collect data on whether or not a project worked, we're not just asking, did you like this project? Did it work for you? We're also asking questions like, what is your daily household income? Has anyone in your household had malaria in the last 6 months? That data sat in hundreds of thousands of Google Excel sheet things, abominations. And there's no longitudinal sort of research that can be done from them because they're not streamlined. They're not built for that sort of like longitudinal querying. And so we have so much historical knowledge that is just lost. And it's a real shame because, in my view, not only is it a shame because we're losing the information, it's what that information represents is community time. Those are people who were sat and spent their time providing us with information for which they were not paid. In many cases, they weren't even the ones receiving the services that they're being asked about. And we've just not, I think, been good stewards of that time as a whole, as an industry. And I think that's a place where blockchain offers a lot of opportunity in terms of, almost information management. So it's a very long way of saying that I think there are a lot of ways that I hope Web3 will come to provide that sort of infrastructure for aid that it has so badly needed for a very long time. Obviously, I do think that it's like a 5 to 10 year kind of conversation, but I think we can start putting some of those building blocks in place now.
Definitely. And I mean, like catching up on that lost historical data, that's so much time and effort that has gone into something like that, and creating a system now that can actually manage it.
Yeah.
It's so highly specific, but it's definitely something that, I mean, like with the technology and the tools that we have now, are you guys integrating at all like any AI or machine learning tools into what you're building?
Yeah. So we're starting to play with this now, and that's because as I said, we're working on an Oracle integration for the foreseeable. That's going to be like a weather integration, and that's going to allow us to respond to 3 inches of rainfall in this village. They're going to have flooding. We're going to get the money there very quickly. But longer term, we really want to make that Oracle interact with community generated data. So we'll be able to query communities in the areas where people are receiving aid, that data back, and make it interact with our smart contracts to release various different aid payments. So we're thinking about this in 2 ways, because obviously we need to format the data in a way that it's usable, but we also need to actually make use of that data. And so again, we don't want to just have a whole team of 10 or 11 consultants who are looking at these data sets and producing reports, and it's very inefficient and slow. And what that means is at the time between, okay, we funded a project, now we're going to evaluate the project, and we have to evaluate it before we can decide whether or not to give them more funding. I have a friend who runs a great INGO right now in Myanmar doing public health or global public health stuff, really focused on mental health in the context of Myanmar during the war. They had funding, they delivered really well on that project, and they're just sat in a dead zone waiting to hear if they're going to get more funding. And so they lose staff. Like, it's a real problem. So trying to shorten that gap, I think using AI tools to do that is going to be really critical to our success. One of the things we have to think about is that the training data we use for a language model for us is probably not going to work with the kinds of training data that are currently available. So we need to be pulling from best practice monitoring and evaluation frameworks, from reports that have been done that we would consider very high quality. So we we're going to be thinking a lot about that in the coming year. But I think in general, we all have a focus on ensuring that data that we're collecting is contributing to conversations and to actual programming in a way that really reflects the value that communities are creating by giving us that data in the first place.
Definitely. I mean, a lot of the time, proper solutions using AI and machine learning do come from having a decent data set to start with and making sure that that data is well structured and properly collected and are good data points, basically.
Yeah.
Do you have any, I guess, like ethical concerns like around the data usage or the data protection or the data privacy and data ethics? There's so many conversations and topics around this specifically, but I mean, like at the start of your journey, those are all, I guess, very important and viable considerations to keep in mind, specifically as you're now like collecting your data points and data sets and like where you're going to use it.
Yeah. And again, I'm an anthropologist, so I am going to be eternally biased on this issue because I am a qualitative researcher. So I will always think that qualitative research gives more insight than big quant data sets. And one of the things that I find really concerning, and I have harped on this for years, is that there is this, I think, growing sense that the bigger the data set, the more self-moderating it is. And so any biases that might be there, any faults in the data collection modalities, whatever, will just naturally even themselves out because the data, there's so much data. And that could not be further from the truth. If you show me the survey that you used or the way that you set up your survey population selection, if you show me any of those details, I can point out to you all the different biases that are going to emerge from that process. And we'll, give you a really big data set that's just wrong. I mean, a great example of this was that there was, I remember I went to a lecture at Oxford when I was doing my master's, and this guy was really excited to talk about how they were looking at this great big data set of all the ethnographic research that ever been done, and they had all these different data points around trying to find if there is a sort of global sense of morality and what those what those might be, those different ideas. And I remember I raised my hand. I was like, can you differentiate in your model between male and female respondents? And they were like, no. And I was like, so that's problem number one. And I said, can you differentiate in your model whether somebody is speaking positively or negatively about that thing? No. So I think that happens a lot more than we realize. And with AI, I'm very concerned about what I see is then the capacity to even further abstract from that bias, the source of bias, saying, but this thing is now, and it's an algorithm, it's making decisions, or we're allowing it to make decisions or choices about certain things, that then even further sort of distances accountability from some of those biases. So that's something that I worry about a lot as an anthropologist, and as just a human in the world. I think super essential now more than ever to have social scientists and people with humanities backgrounds engaged in technology and the development of this sort of technological scaffolding that is now being used to create the world we live in. I think there has been a trend, particularly in the US where I'm from, to sort of undermine the value that those sort of areas bring to the world because we don't, associate them with making lots of money. And unfortunately, I think that has really impoverished a lot of the technology that we're building because we're building things in a way that is absent those sort of moral or philosophical questions about not just what can this thing do, but what kind of world are we building? And it's something we're thinking about a lot at KoalaPay. What kind of world are we building? If we say we want to build a new infrastructure for aid, we want to build a world that is directing more resources to local partners. We want to shift the power dynamics in favor of those local aid organizations. And there is an element of sort of social design going into what we're doing. And we want to be very cognizant of that and very thoughtful because if you are saying this current way of doing something, we want to replace it with something else, it's not just, does it work better for some? It's, does it work better for everyone, including the people who have historically been marginalized or have been forgotten from those systems. So all of this to say, thinking a lot about AI and other technologies as well, but really with that focus that these aren't just tools, they are now building blocks for our society, and we want to make sure that we're building towards a society that people want to live in, not a society that people need to survive.
Thank you for sharing that specific sentiment as well with us. I think I just have a couple last questions for you, and this is a nice kind of direction to take it in as well. Do you have any advice for any newcomers to both the Web3 space and into your sectors, especially those who maybe come from a more non-technical background like yourself, kind of taking this journey now into this world?
I guess I would flip that on its head a little bit and sort of say, I think I would love to see folks from tech backgrounds, and especially the people who invest in them and their companies, to really see the value in those alternative skill sets. I think there's, you hear this all the time in like VC Twitter and whatever else, where it's sort of like, the best businesses are ones that are, everyone's a designer or a developer. And then I think undermines what most companies should be doing. Of course, there are companies where it's just really not necessary. That's fine. But in general, the idea that you want to have perspectives from folks who are thinking about what it means to be a good person, living a good life in a place with other people who are trying to do the same, but who might see the world differently. I mean, I think that is a really essential question that a lot of us should be thinking about as we're building these new infrastructures for humanity. And the only way that we're going to get those perspectives embedded in those technologies is if the people who are in a position to make decisions about who joins the team, whose views are valued, who gets funding, are thinking about that proactively and really putting their finger on the lever so that we can ensure that those perspectives are being taken into consideration and properly valued. So I would say if you're a non-technical person, but you're brilliant at moral philosophy, I would love to have more of those people participating in AI companies. I would love to see people who have backgrounds in international aid doing more work in Web3, especially if this is a Web3 company that says, well, we do social impact. Carbon credits, I mean, it's a great example of a place where having qualitative researchers who are involved in thinking about these things and who say, hey, look, you can design this survey in a way that gives you the result that you want. So this carbon credit looks legit. But actually, here are all the unintended negative consequences that have happened in this community because of this project. Like those are really valuable interventions. And I think that, really being aware of that. And of course, as an anthropologist, I will always say, hire more anthropologists, they're great. But what they're really good at is that I joke sometimes that, my favorite quote in anthropology is that anthropology is a discipline of counter-hegemonic thinking. Having somebody sat at the table who has not, quote unquote, drank the Kool-Aid is a very valuable thing to have in your company. And I think we should encourage more of that, not less of it.
Thank you. Brilliant. Yes. To end off, maybe I'm actually like, what is driving you to keep pushing in this field and to keep pushing boundaries? What is your personal drive that you can maybe leave everyone with as a last thought? Something that's been on your mind a lot, something that's still driving you, something that's still pushing you, making you wake up every morning to keep doing this mission.
Yeah. Well, we're in the middle of a fundraising round right now. So I think anyone who's ever done that will know that it can be so demoralizing. And such an energy suck. And so I've been spending a lot of time doing that. And that was starting to really get to me. I was, feeling like it's just exhausting and I'm not enjoying this. And then I got on a call we're launching our first local partners on the marketplace probably next week. And they're organizations working in Myanmar. They are organizations that have been really struggling to get funding through because they're working in what are called ethnic areas of the country where there's been a lot of conflict, where the military junta has very intentionally and strategically strangled financial access. So people who are really putting their lives on the line to deliver things like food support or shelter, health, life-saving services to people. And these are organizations that are asking for very little. They're asking for 5,000 here, 3,000 there to do things like, bring solar power to all of their health clinics or to feed. One of the local partners submitted an activity proposal that was, I think, $3,000 equivalent to feed 125 elderly people who've been displaced through the conflict for 5 months. And we're talking about huge impact for very little. And when we got on the first call with all of them, and we were all sat together, and it's a sort of trust building exercise because in the Myanmar context, a lot of aid workers are being targeted by the military, and there's a huge uptick in violence towards them, state violence specifically. So we needed to build trust with them so they would feel safe joining the QualiPay platform, and sitting with them and explaining to them how a stablecoin works and how that can protect the funds that they have worked so hard to fundraise, or why having a self-custody wallet will protect them from the military-controlled banks actually sort of intervening in their ability to access their funding, to be able to do things in a way that is censorship resistant, safe, It was so uplifting for me to be able to offer a solution to the people who are out there putting their lives on the line to support their communities, and who are so often overlooked because it's easier to give to UNICEF or to Oxfam than it is to find these local organizations and build trust with them. Actually being able to offer those solutions and say, we're here and we're thinking about you and we're building something that's for you, was like, it could keep me going for years, and however many like crappy VC calls I have to do, you know, whatever it is, it would fuel me for a decade, because it was so so touching to be able to do even a very small thing to support those absolute heroes. Which I will just say before sort of wrapping things up, but we are, for the most part, individuals will not be able to access the Qualipay platform. It will be sort of corporate users or institutional users. We are doing a friends and family beta for these first 4 local organizations in Myanmar. There's about 8 activities available to fund. If you are a person who really loves crypto, really loves, you know, blockchain for good as a concept, and want to support what we're doing, and more specifically support these incredible local organizations, please do send me an email. We'll add you to the whitelist as a sort of friends and family from Web3 Sanctuary, and get you on there, and then you'll be in. So even when we close it off to individuals in the future, you'll be able to stay involved, and we'll have new projects coming online in Bhutan, Somalia, Sudan, and Kenya in the next couple of months. So we would love to have some folks from this community involved in this first round, so that we can really support these really incredible organizations.
Perfect. Amazing. Melyn, thank you so much for that response, and for all the incredible work that you're doing through Qualipay. So for any of you that are interested in getting involved, please just drop us a message. We'll share some details with you so that you can contact Melyn to reach out, to get involved, to help out. I think it's an incredible mission that you're working towards, and I'm really stoked to have you here. It's been really great getting to know you as well. But yeah, I think that actually pretty much closes us up then for today. And just to close off, Web3 in the real world, we're aiming to be more than just a podcast. We want to create a community of forward thinkers, change makers, and believers in the power of this technology to create a positive change. And Melyn, I think no one has more embodied this more than you have today in this episode. And I've learned a lot, and I've definitely got a lot of research to do as well, I think, after this call. But thank you so much for everyone that did dial in and watched. Subscribe, tune in, and be a part of the conversation shaping the future of Web3 with us and Web3 in the real world.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.